In a town where whispers could kill and lies ran deeper than the river, a grieving widow was dragged from her home, accused of witchcraft, and thrown into the cold current by the very settlers she'd once fed. No one stepped in until a reclusive widower, haunted by his own past, heard her scream. He hadn't spoken to a soul in years, but that day he rode through the river with a gun in one hand. And what happened next rewrote the town's legacy forever. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Under a sky streaked with ash-colored clouds and the scent of rain-soaked earth? Clara Bennett's screams were swallowed by the roar of the river as rough hands dragged her toward the current. Her black mourning dress heavy with mud and grief as the settlers, men who once danced at her wedding, shouted over one another with false piety and red-rimmed hatred, calling her a witch, a curse, a widow who defied her place by refusing the preacher's advances and burying her husband without their permission. But Clara, breath ragged and wrists raw, stared defiantly at the water even as it licked her boots, knowing her late husband Samuel would haunt every one of these cowards who dared touch her. And just as her feet slipped from the muddy bank and the water surged up to her waist, hooves thundered down the river trail like judgment itself, and a man in a dust-coated duster, black hat pulled low, fired 2 shots into the air, scattering birds and freezing every settler in place as one woman gasped, "It's Elijah Harper." And indeed it was, the rich, reclusive widower who hadn't shown his face in town since his wife died 3 winters back, whose land was bigger than any 5 homesteads combined, who carried the look of a man who'd buried too many dreams and trusted too few hearts, and now his eyes, green and furious, locked on Clara's shivering form as he leapt from his horse mid-gallop, water crashing around him as he reached for her with one strong arm and snarled at the settlers like a wolf who'd finally had enough, lifting her like she weighed no more than a child and cradling her against his chest as she shook not from fear, but from the sheer crushing fact that someone had come for her, someone who didn't look away when things got ugly, someone who rode straight into the ugliest moment of her life without hesitation. And as the preacher sputtered, "She's cursed, Elijah. She killed her own husband." Elijah set Clara gently on the riverbank, turned to face them all, and said with quiet venom, "I buried my wife too, preacher. Grief doesn't make you a witch, but lies do." And before anyone could answer, his revolver was out and pointed not at a man but at the sky, one final warning shot before he growled, "Touch her again, and I'll turn this river red." And they believed him, every last one, because behind those eyes was the kind of man who had nothing left to lose except the last bit of his soul, and he'd be damned if he let that slip away while good people bled. So while they scattered like cowards and melted into the trees, Elijah knelt beside Clara, wrapped her trembling fingers in his, and whispered, "I've seen hell too, widow. Don't go walking into it alone." And from that day on, the town whispered a new tale, not of the cursed widow, but of the widower who rode into the river like a storm sent by God. And as Clara healed in Elijah's warm, cedar-scented cabin perched high in the canyon, where he lived with only horses and silence for company, she slowly began to untangle the knot of sorrow that had buried itself in her chest since Samuel's death, finding laughter again in the small things, his clumsy attempts at cooking, the way he read aloud from old books in that deep, unreadable voice, or how he built her a bench overlooking the river not to watch the water, but to own it, to face the place where she almost died and let it become the place where she came back to life. And every morning he'd say nothing, but leave a warm cup of tea on the table before heading out to work the land, until one day she placed her hand on his and asked, "What did you see in me that day?" And Elijah looked at her long and hard and answered, "Someone I wasn't too late to save, because in his heart, he was still chasing ghosts, his wife, his unborn son, the years lost to silence. But in Clara, he saw something raw and unbroken, a future not written in loss, and though the town kept its distance, whispering behind cupped hands, It was Clara who stood tall in the trading post, voice clear and proud as she told off the preacher's wife who dared call her unclean. It was Elijah who stared down the banker when he threatened to repossess a grieving woman's land. And it was both of them, widow and widower, who returned to the river one gray dawn to scatter wildflower seeds along the banks, a symbol not of death but of roots, rebirth, and the quiet kind of love that doesn't shout, doesn't beg, but simply stays. And when drought came and the land cracked, it was Clara who led the effort to bring water back with irrigation ditches and shared labor, while Elijah offered lumber and labor without payment. And when disease swept through the valley, it was their cabin that opened to orphaned children and widowed mothers alike, becoming a refuge built not of riches but of redemption, and the town slowly and shamefully began to see them not as outcasts but as anchors, pillars holding up what was left of decency in a place where law and faith had failed. And when a traveling judge finally came through to investigate the preacher's past, it was Clara who testified, voice steady, detailing the night of the attempted drowning with each settler named, and Elijah who stood beside her, revolver on his hip and honor in his eyes. And one by one the accusers were fined, humiliated or run out, and though justice came late, it came, and afterward, at a small gathering under the cottonwood tree by the river, Clara laid a single rose in the water, not for Samuel alone, but for every woman whose voice had ever been drowned out by fear, and beside her Elijah did the same, letting the wind carry the scent of roses and river water as his fingers brushed hers, not by accident but by intent. And though neither of them spoke of love, it settled between them like the sun after storm, slow and inevitable, and years later when they built a schoolhouse from salvaged wood and named it The River's Turn, people understood, because by then Clara Harper was no longer whispered about, but looked to, and Elijah, once the reclusive widower, was known as the man who showed up, not just that one day by the river, but every day after, the man who taught the town that strength didn't always shout. Sometimes it carried a woman out of the current, sometimes it built a garden from grief, and sometimes it simply stayed beside someone long enough for them to heal. And the river never took another soul again, not because it changed, but because someone finally stood between its rage and the innocent and never stepped aside.